Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone, and welcome to the keynote speaker, or second keynote speaker of the conference, Julia Barfield. I would like to welcome you all to this keynote session. It's a pleasure that I introduce our second keynote speaker, distinguished architect, Julia Barfield. Julia is a founding director of Marks Barfield Architects, together with husband and partner, David Marks. Also the originators and creative entrepreneurs behind the design and realization of the London Eye and the Brighton Eye 360. A graduate of the Architecture Association, Julia has worked for Richard Rogers and Partners and Foster Associates. She was project architect and was a project architect for the Sackler Galleries in the Royal Academy. Julia chaired the RIBA Awards for 3 years and the Sterling Prize panel in 2019. She is currently the honorary professor at Queen's University Belfast, and she has lectured in many universities and conferences in the UK, US, Italy, Germany, Mexico, and China. Jointly with David Marks, Julia has received the Prince Philip Designers Prize and the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation. Her talk title today is Towards a New Vernacular in the Age of Climate Emergency. Julia, it's a pleasure to introduce you, and thank you very much for being with us today. And now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Gamal, and it's a pleasure to be here. A year has passed since I last addressed this conference, and it feels like so much has changed. In fact, it feels like almost everything has changed in the last 2 years. Not just as a result of COVID, but also as a result of the ever more evident, irrefutable and urgency of the climate and environmental emergency that we all face. But on the plus side, there's been a huge activity in this area among concerned built environment professionals. And I feel I've learned so much. But first, just a reminder about my practice that as you said, I started with David Marks more than 30 years ago. Our project portfolio is unusually diverse across many sectors: culture, education, infrastructure, leisure, workplace, public realm, and the sacred. And it also includes, as you said, self-generated projects like the London Eye and Brighton Eye 360, where we made the leap to become entrepreneurs as well as architects. We've been told that our work is difficult to categorize, which we relish, actually. We don't have a house style. And because we've kept the practice relatively small, we don't have a huge portfolio of completed projects. But each project gets a huge amount of attention and is unique, coming as it does from a thorough understanding of the client's needs and aspirations, the site and its context, its history, its broader and social and environmental imperatives. Indeed, it would be strange to us if each project was not very different. We're now 15 strong. We operate from a studio in Clapham, South London, although we haven't been there very much in the last 18 months. We've always had a strong, we've always maintained a 50-50 gender balance, and we have a strong social ethic. Indeed, David and I spent our year out in South America, where we helped to design self-built housing types for a barriada in Lima, Peru, which was a very rewarding experience. And just a few years ago, we were asked to define what design meant to us. And we came up with this, which is that design is a very powerful tool for good, both social and environmental. And at its best, it improves the quality of people's lives and lifts their spirits, while hopefully drawing on a minimum of the Earth's limited resources. That sort of sums up where our what we try to do and why. I mean, we've always integrated sustainability in our projects from the very start, using passive design principles and orientation to maximize natural light and ventilation and minimize energy use. And there's a few examples that I'd like to show you. This is a Michael Tippett school, which is for deprived children, we had many aspects of it that were in the sustainable category. We made sure that they had lots of natural light, very high ceilings, a green roof, plenty of thermal mass, CHP, and plenty of natural light. And we also made sure that it was adaptable for future use. the lightbox in our cultural project in Woking is very contextual. It sits on a sliver of a site between a 5-lane highway and a very green canal. And as such, it responds to each of those, the context very differently. On the road side being quite defensive, but then on the canal side being very wooden and creating a garden, a south-facing garden on the right. And we bring all the natural ventilation in from the canal side to naturally ventilate the building. And then our think tank, which is used by Nottingham University now, which is a building that has elevations on the different sides which directly respond to its orientation. So the north-facing side, for instance, has no shading, the south-facing side has horizontal shading, and the west facade has vertical shading. So very much responding to its context. And also we introduced ground source heat pumps at that time, although the client felt the need to put a gas boiler in at the same time, even though it wasn't needed, which was quite frustrating. Our ethos is one where we like to work in close collaboration with engineers from the concept stage. And we like to ensure that any design that emerges from the way the building works, not simply by the way it looks. We also like to work with specialist subcontractors. Indeed, working collaboratively with specialist subcontractors has been a theme running through a lot of our work. And we found that the best way of developing innovative design is with the people who are actually going to make it. So in the London Eye, for example, we established a very strong relationship with Hollandia, who built the structure, and with Poma, who built the capsules. And their relationships that have lasted more than 25 years. This is Poma's factory that they set up specially for the capsules on the London Eye. And this is Hollandia's factory when they were making the structure for the London Eye. And they're relationships that have lasted more than 25 years because we then collaborated with both of them on the Brighton I360. But on our treetop walkway in Kew as well, we developed the design with Britland Steel, who made the structure out of Corten. And I will be talking a bit later about Bloomer Lehman, who we built the Cambridge Mosque with. Again, we involved them at an early stage to develop the design. Indeed, I regard these companies as the master craftsmen of our times. But coming back to the theme of change and disruption, we're undoubtedly living through an age of huge disruption and change. And I don't just mean COVID. We're seeing it in so many aspects of our lives, in technology, social media, politics, and of course, climate. Malign and benign forces seem to swirl around us in equal measure, and we need to put our energies into ensuring that the forces of good prevail. COVID has shown us that what seemed impossible suddenly becomes possible, for instance, with the astonishing state intervention that was forthcoming in terms of furlough from our current government. And COVID has been disruptive, but it's also been a great accelerator and obviously accelerated a lot of digital connectiveness, as with this conference. But as disruptive as COVID has been, and its inevitable disastrous financial fallout will be, they pale into insignificance compared to the global impact of the impending climate and environmental emergency. It's clear that the big disruptor to our traditions because of is that, and because our response to it determines starkly whether we have a livable planet. The emergency is unequivocally with us now, as we've seen in this summer all over the world, with floods in Germany, in West Africa, fires in Greece, Italy, and Spain, and unheard of temperatures in North America and indeed the north of Africa. And what I find most scary about this is that it seems that it's progressing faster than many scientists have predicted. In the words of David Attenborough, we are now on the verge of passing tipping points, boundaries once passed that will unleash irreversible and self-amplifying change. And there's strong evidence that we're within a decade of passing these tipping points and committing millions of people to floods, famine, fires, and forced migration. What woke me up to the urgency of the situation was when I read the IPCC report in October 2018, when the world's top scientists warned that we have 12 years to limit climate and environmental catastrophe. And it seemed to me and many others at that time that we should act accordingly. But now IPCC has brought out another report on the 9th of August this year, where it issued what it called a code red alarm. And now they're saying that our carbon budget that gives the best odds of staying within 1.5 degrees runs out in 5.5 years at current emissions rates. And these emissions rates seem to not be going down, they seem to continue to go up. And records of temperatures are constantly being busted, like this July was the hottest ever. And even today, I saw the IPCC is warning that we risk going to 2.5 degrees by the 2040s. It's all very, very, very scary. And for the built environment, of course, we have to listen. Because the built environment's construction sector contributes disproportionately to the problem. 49% of CO2 emissions in the UK are down to the construction industry. So it's beholden on us to contribute to solving it. We are creative problem solvers after all. So I joined a number of architects, mainly practice leaders, and we launched Architects Declare in May 2019. It's based around these 11 pledges that each practice signs up to, which is about raising awareness, advocating faster change towards regenerative design practices, reducing carbon and waste, and sharing knowledge. And it is spread beyond our expectations, first to other disciplines, but then also, so this is the number of companies, both architects and engineers in the UK who are signed up, and now it's spread to 27 countries worldwide. And there's almost 7,000 companies worldwide who've signed up to the 11 pledges. We recognized that change needs to happen at a system level. And what we're trying to do is change mindsets. So at various events that we had an event where we invited Kate Raworth to talk, for example. And she talked to us about her donut economics, which has imagined a whole new economic paradigm with humanity and social justice at its core, and measures that ensure that we stay within planetary limits on the outside the donut. And I really like this quote of hers, which says that currently we have an economy that needs to grow whether or not it makes us thrive. But what we need is an economy that makes us thrive whether or not we grow. Because at this time in history, we need to question the thinking and fundamental assumptions that have got us into this mess. For instance, like GDP, which has, as a measure of success, I feel is so, and many economists feel is so outdated. How could it possibly make sense to champion infinite growth on a finite planet, particularly one like ours that is in such a fragile state? We also had Roman Krasnarek at another one of our events to talk about his book, The Good Ancestor. And this is about long-term thinking and intergenerational justice and how we should all become good ancestors. And that was when I heard that phrase, it's one of those phrases the way you say, of course, obviously, we all need to become good ancestors. And we need to stop thinking short-term and think long-term, as many indigenous peoples have always done. But that's the scary bit. But I think there's also a lot of hope to be had, because there's, as I said at the beginning, there's huge amount of energy around this issue in the construction industry, especially among young architects and engineers. And there's lots of voluntary groups, young professionals giving freely of their time and energy outside of work hours that are creating organizations like LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, and ACAN, Architects Climate Action Network, which are really making huge progress in this area. And together, ACAN, LETI, and many other organizations, we're collaborating hugely to multiply our effect. And I just put this classic kind of climate cartoon in, just as a gentle reminder that if we respond to the climate crisis in the right way, it's actually going to make people's lives better. I've personally changed so much of my personal choices around what I buy, what I eat, and how I travel. I mean, I don't intend to fly for pleasure again, for example, but I've no intention of it letting that curb my wanderlust. I love trains, and I think I'm healthier as a result. I walk, bicycle a lot more, and I think eat better. And of course, the air will be a lot cleaner. Apparently, 3 times more people died of pollution during COVID than died of COVID. So that's got to be a good thing. So how can we as professionals in the built environment respond to this conundrum? And I think actually there's a lot we can do. I mean, this is my summary of the kind of 5 main things, or the 9 main things that we can do in combating the crisis. We need to become more carbon literate. We need to calculate and measure our carbon as we become more literate. We need to move to a circular rather than a linear mindset. We need to drive down and regulate embodied carbon and move to a plant-based biomaterials products. We need to move to adaptive reuse of design of existing buildings, and any new buildings that we do build should be radically adaptable and disassemblable. And actually, probably we need to build less and join a movement. So taking those one at a time, we need to become more carbon literate. We need to understand what the carbon actually means. And for our practice, we get together weekly for our CPDs, office meetings, and design review. And in the last 18 months, we've concentrated on becoming more carbon literate. And the majority of our CPDs have been climate related. And we're currently calculating our own carbon footprint. We haven't quite finished it yet. We will do very soon. And we need to drive down and regulate embodied carbon. One of the ways that the climate emergency has changed our definition of sustainable architecture is in consideration of embodied carbon. And in those early projects that I showed you at the beginning, we mainly concentrated on energy in use. But now we know that embodied carbon is as, if not more important. And I'm sure most of you know exactly what embodied carbon is, but just for those who maybe don't, embodied carbon is a measure of the carbon used in extraction of materials, manufacture, transportation, and construction. And the point is that most of that carbon is spent up front. As you see with the Letty diagram on the left, you can see that most of that carbon is spent up front. And because building projects are have such a long time frame, it's absolutely critical that this embodied carbon at the front of projects is kept low. And then you can see with the diagram on the right that most of the embodied carbon is in structure and envelope. And this is one of ACAN's slides, which shows that, as the grid decarbonizes, buildings can have 75% of the carbon from buildings can be actually the embodied carbon. So it's critical that we move to reduce that. And we need to calculate the whole life carbon of our buildings. So the whole life carbon is actually the combination of the in use and embodied. And this is the diagram we've done showing that the whole life carbon calculation that is currently a kind of norm, and we've actually made it into a circular diagram, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we're starting to measure the carbon in some of our buildings. So this is the mosque that I'll tell you a bit more about in later on in the talk. And we've tried to calculate the embodied carbon of the mosque. And it's been so interesting. We've actually been able to see the carbon of all of the different aspects. I mean, one of the things that we were surprised at, for example, was that the steel reinforcement actually is huge compared to what you'd think. And we've looked at every aspect, including we had Gilbert Ashes, a Northern Ireland contractor, build the mosque, and they weekly flew back and forth to Northern Ireland. So that's been calculated as well. But at the final figure, if you take if you include sequestration, is actually quite low. But if you don't include sequestration, it does go up a bit. but that's mainly because we have an underground car park. So we also need to move towards a more circular and regenerative mindset. We can no longer take, use and dispose. We need to make sure that raw materials in particular are kept within at a higher grade as much as possible within a circular system. And we need to move to adaptive reuse of existing buildings and where possible not demolish at all. We can't continue to put the buildings of the past in landfill today, and we certainly can't put the buildings of today in landfill tomorrow. We need to retrofit and reuse, and the government can help by removing VAT on refurbishment, which is completely the wrong incentive to have. I mean, this is a project that we did a few years ago, which was taking 3 separate buildings and uniting them around this new atrium to form a 21st century office. And this is the kind of thing that we need to do more of. And this is a project in Copenhagen where they've actually taken sections of brick from demolished buildings and just put them together in a whole new way, keeping the materials at the highest level. And this is an interesting project in Norway, the powerhouse, which is actually energy positive. During its operation, it generates more energy than is used for the production of materials, construction, operation, and disposal. The embodied energy is offset by the on-site generated power over the life of the building using geothermal and a huge rooftop array of PVs. So when we design new buildings, we need to make sure they're adaptable, flexible, and designed for disassembly. And a great example of this, it may be small, but it's perfectly formed, is this whole building that was built on the South Bank as an office for using Walter Stiegel principles of self-build, and it was bolted together. So at the end of its use, we unbolted it, and then some fourth year students, architectural students, then redesigned it for a new site for a charity in Stockwell. And you can see the 4 stages of that there, and it's still in use, and it's still being cherished by the children's charity. So it's a really good example of disassembly and reuse. We also need to move to plant-based biomaterials, just as we need to move towards plant-based a diet in our own diets. So does architecture needs a plant-based diet. And of course, there's many examples of this. Oh, yes. Whoops, sorry. I mean, hempcrete, for example, is carbon negative. It's got more atmospheric carbon locked away in the material for the lifetime of the building than was used in its production and use. And this is an example on the right by Practice Architecture, where they actually grew the hemp in the fields beyond and then used it to build the building. That's a fabulous example. And then this is an example of using thatch in a very contemporary way. So traditional materials in a very contemporary way, as is this, the Enterprise Centre by Archetype, using thatch and straw in a completely new way. And you know, what we're looking at now is using straw as a panelized system. So using modern methods of construction, but using traditional materials. So I think this is where we start to see the new vernacular. And of course, there's the use of round earth, which I think is really beautifully shown by this War Thistleton Bushy Cemetery building in North London. And of course, people are looking at using mushrooms, mycelium, both as an insulator and as a structural material. All of these, and of course, there's the cork house as well, which I don't have a picture of. And stone as well. Stone is a very low carbon material. You just take it out of the ground and you can use it for structure. So all of these things are new kind of uses of material that we need to move to. And we need to build less. of course. I mean, I just heard a fantastic story about how some engineers were asked to design a new car park for Heathrow because there were peaks in demand that they couldn't accommodate. But a bright spark decided to ask a few questions and found out that the peaks coincided with flights from India, where the custom is for the whole family to go and meet a returning member in multiple cars. So that was what was causing the peaks. So they suggested that the solution to the problem, rather than build a new building, was to spread out the flights from India, eliminating the new need for a new car park. It's asking the right questions at the beginning of a project that could become very impactful. And then, of course, there's joining a movement. I went to a talk by the veteran American environmentalist Bill McKibben, and at the end of the talk, somebody asked him, but what can I do as an individual? And he said very quickly, just don't be one, don't be an individual, join a movement. You'll be much more impactful that way. So, towards a new vernacular. I've attempted a definition of a new vernacular here. And I think we've seen in those plant-based materials and biomaterials, they really do put you in mind of vernacular architecture. And it's no coincidence, because it seems to me that we do need to move towards a new vernacular to respond to this existential threat that we all face. So it's a type of local and regional construction using traditional materials and resources, technology from the area where the building is located. The materials are used efficiently, easily maintained and with no waste. The architecture is influenced by its context, geographic features and culture, unique to different places in the world, becoming a means of reaffirming identity, and built to meet specific needs, values, and the economy and lifestyles of a specific culture. And of course, in order to help me with this definition, I lent heavily on the masters. But I think we can learn from the past and look to the future, not in a nostalgic way, and it has nothing to do with style. And maybe we can find an architecture that discovers a new way of embracing global knowledge, technology, and connectiveness while creating local conceptual buildings that are unique to their place. And I'm now going to explain the thinking behind our Cambridge Central Mosque, because although it doesn't fit all the vernacular criteria, and it is a very unique project, I think it could show a potential direction of travel, not just in the use of materials and its local contextual response, but also in the important issue of local cultural identity and as a cultural bridge and cultural bridge building in a diverse and global world. So the mosque was a competition that we won in 2009. It's actually been a long project. With a growing population of Muslims in Cambridge, there was an acute lack of prayer space, and the brief called for a mosque to accommodate 1,000 worshippers, as well as teaching and community space. And we hadn't done a mosque before, so of course we did a lot of research. And looking at mosques around the world, we discovered that for centuries and throughout the world, mosques have adapted to their local cultural and climatic conditions and adopted local vernacular using building materials and technologies available in their place and in their time. You can see that a Chinese mosque is very different from an Indian mosque, is very different from one from North Africa. And this is key. So we asked ourselves, how should a British mosque be designed for the 21st century? We studied the best of British sacred tradition, especially English fan vaulting, together with centuries-old Islamic design and its genius for geometry. And in the words of my partner, David Marks, who developed the concept, we didn't want to create a replica or a pastiche. Indeed, we wanted to bring together the two traditions to create a mosque unique to its time and place, where modernity and innovation meet timeless sacred principles, using the universal language of geometry and nature. David also identified the idea of the Garden of Paradise as a key inspiration, a calm oasis in a glade of trees. So the glade of trees on the site became the structural trees that joined to form the geometric canopy roof. And they're then enclosed by the structural CLT walls, which are then clad in masonry tiles. We also asked our Professor Keith Critchlow, who's an expert in sacred Islamic geometry, to join our team. In fact, he was one of our tutors at the AA in the early 70s. So he suggested the underlying geometry for the building, which is based on the breadth of the compassionate pattern. And that in itself is based on octagons. So we then pulled up the pattern into the structural trees, going through many iterations, many different stages, with us using our sophisticated in-house 3D modeling capacity. And at this stage, we then searched through the UK and Europe to find a company with the appropriate timber expertise and the willingness to rise to the challenge. And having looked far and wide, mainly in Europe and the UK, Bloom & Lehman became the obvious choice as a Swiss company. And together we developed with them the concept to detailed design. We brought them on board early, even before we got planning, because as I said earlier, if you're designing something innovative that hasn't been done before, you need the benefit of that construction knowledge to ensure that what you're drawing is possible, A, and affordable, B. And I can't resist showing you this, which is an image of Bloom & Lehman's working model, which to my mind is one of the most beautiful working drawings that I've ever seen. You can see in where I've zoomed in that it's got every single piece in 3D with all the joints and fixings. As I said earlier, they are the master craftsmen of the 21st century. So this is how the building sits on the site. It's in a residential area, and we wanted the building to embed itself very much into the local context. And indeed, the client had involved the local community right from an early stage. In fact, they sat on the interviewing panel to choose the architect. So they took a very serious and intelligent view of involving the local community, the non-Muslim community, in the whole process to make sure that it sat comfortably in the community. But as you can see, so the building aligns with the street at the front and then turns towards Mecca at the rear, with the prayer hall stepping up at the rear and down towards the road, which is on the right in this section. Somehow we wanted to fit in and stand out at the same time. It is a major civic building, after all, set in its domestic context. The material choice of the cladding was inspired by the local galt of the Cambridge area, with its red brick highlights, as you can see in the two images on the right-hand side. But then we also developed to incorporate Kufic patterning and a text that reads, "Say he is God, the one." That's at a slight angle with the gold, the red protruding to the prayer hall and the mosque itself. So visitors are welcomed. If you go from left to right, visitors are welcomed through the procession of spaces, from the busy street on the left-hand side, through a community garden, and then through an Islamic garden, through a loggia, and then into an atrium, gradually moving from the day-to-day to the reflective and the spiritual, and moving on through the ablution areas, which are in blue, to the prayer hall itself, which is orientated, as I said, towards Mecca on the Qibla wall. Social and environmental sustainability were a key driver from the beginning, and it was intended to be inclusive and open, non-denominational, and welcoming to the wider community. A cultural bridge, if you like, as well as one of the UK's leading women-friendly mosques. Timber is not only beautiful, it's also renewable and is one of the most sustainable of all building materials. We worked very closely with both the structural and the environmental engineers to maximize the daylight in all the public areas such that no artificial lighting is needed during daylight hours. We've also taken a fabric first approach where the building is designed to ultra low U values with airtight construction to minimize energy need in the first place and energy loss. It's also naturally ventilated with the air coming in at low level and rising at high level. The rainwater is harvested and feeds the WCs and garden irrigation. And we have rooftop photovoltaics that heat all the hot water and all the cooling and 13% of the heating. And you can see around the ablution areas, we have air source heat pumps, which extract heat from the external air and balance the heating and cooling demands of the building. So there's the building from the street and through the Islamic garden. And some of the grillage, which was also designed by Keith Critchlow, the patterning, Islamic patterning. And this is the atrium. And some of the detailing of the doors with this octagonal geometry running through the ablution areas, the ablution area for the women on the left and the men on the right, all naturally ventilated. And this is the prayer hall full of worshippers, and some of the detailing of around the prayer hall itself, the coloured glass. And as I said, very much a women-friendly mosque. This is a view from one of the women's area, where if they choose to be separate, they can. But as you see, we have a mashrabiyah screen that can actually be removed if that was ever possible. So, as I said, maybe we can find an architecture that discovers a new way of embracing global knowledge, 21st century technology and connectiveness to create local, low carbon, in use and embodied contextual buildings that are unique to their place, and somehow at the same time celebrate and bring together the diverse cultural identities which our global world has created. Because the climate and biodiversity emergency is with us now. And we've had too many first false starts. This is Time magazine covers from 1989. And I think the false starts that we've had have been due mainly because of the fossil fuel industry's addiction to their liquid gold. I mean, whenever I use the word emergency, my pulse quickens. And yet, in the words of the inspiring Scottish barrister Polly Higgins, who was the one who started the campaign to make ecocide a crime, and that's another one of those things where you think, yes, ecocide, that has actually got to be a crime. It's just one of those obvious things that you, when you hear it, you think, of course. But she had this wonderful reaction to the word emergency. She said, emergency means a state of emergence. So it's not necessarily something to fear, but a moment in time when we can actually turn things around and something new can come into being. But as we know, there's no time to lose. The science is clear. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Julia. That's really fantastic.
Yes,
Mark?
we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So everyone can use the question and answer panel at the bottom of your Zoom tab to put questions in if you'd like. Certainly you can do that. Well, Julia, thank you for a very nice presentation and an excellent body of work that you've been doing, certainly tied to all sorts of issues of sustainability, not just environmental sustainability, social sustainability, fiscal sustainability certainly matters. I wonder if there's a topic called virtual sustainability. Given the kind of topic of our conference here, I'm wondering if you could share with us, you've talked a bit about this, some advantages of this increasingly virtual world as it relates to what you call the climate emergency. So what are some advantages of this virtual world? But also, I think it would be helpful, given your experience, to think of the disadvantages of this increasingly virtual world in ways that architects and landscape architects and faculty can think about the climate emergency. So some advantages and disadvantages of the virtual world in relationship to this rupture or climate emergency.
Well, I mean, an obvious advantage, I suppose, is we're kind of witnessing here today is that, lots of people have not got on an airplane and flown to a place which, is an advantage in terms of CO2. And I think the advantage is that it means that these events can be seen by so many more people. And as it becomes more common to just participate in these. I mean, I'm a member of the RCA, of the RSA, and during COVID, I attended an event that had more than 1,000 people from all over the world attending it. And a normal RSA event could have only had 300 people. So, I mean, I think that's an obvious advantage, is kind of disseminating knowledge and events globally. But obviously, face-to-face communication is also invaluable. So I think that one of the disadvantages is that is going to happen less. But I think we just need to get used to that, because clearly we do need to fly less. But also, I think in disseminating knowledge, certainly during this last period, as I talked about the both ourselves as Architects Declare and Architects Climate Action Network, there have been a huge number of events online with hundreds of architects and engineers attending, to learn about all of the things that I've been talking about, the circular economy and these new materials and technologies. That has been a huge advantage, and we've become used to that now. We can just sit down at 7 o'clock in the evening, you've had something to eat, and then you have another education session and increase your knowledge. I feel I've increased my knowledge hugely over the last year or 18 months.
We have a question from Stuart Birch. So thank you for the presentation. Wonderful to see the London Eye. Given the sensitive location and your remark about fitting in yet standing out, do you have a view about high-rise urban development and heritage landscapes such as Westminster? And was UNESCO right to remove Liverpool's World Heritage status?
Well, yes, I do. I mean, I live in Stockwell, which is not far from there, and certainly in Vauxhall at the moment. I don't know if anyone's aware, but there's a huge number of tall buildings being built. I mean, really, to my mind, an excessive number, because they're not. I don't regard them as architecture, really. I regard them as three-dimensional capital. If that's not being too rude. Because they're just, that's what they are. They're three-dimensional capital, and although they're not in a World Heritage Site, they're not quite as close as they could be to the World Heritage Site of Parliament. They're not far from it, I think we need to stop building those kind of buildings. To be frank, I think they are a blight on the city.
Well, that could be a challenge in areas that are facing pressures of in-migration. How does one deal with density if you stop building those types of buildings? What would you do in that regard, and how could one learn lessons from vernacular traditions to deal with density?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on density, but I think when talking about density, a lot of people will start talking about Paris, and the kind of density that Paris has is huge. It's very high, and yet they've obviously avoided too many high-rise buildings. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not against high-rise buildings per se, because you know, I think there are many fantastic examples of high-rise buildings in London, you know, the Barbican and even, you know, a number of high-rise buildings, the Millbank, they're actually listed. So I'm not against high-rise buildings. I think it's to do with the quality of them.
Mm-hmm.
I just think they need to be of a certain quality to really be justified. And if they're not of that quality, then they're not. So I think there are other ways to create the additional accommodation that we do need, as you rightly say, with populations going up and inward migration.
Mm-hmm. Some additional questions coming in from Andrew Moneta. She couldn't find the minaret in your design. So I know that sometimes a controversial element in European countries being a very high landmark in the skyline. So how did you resolve this in the design of the mosque?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't get the first bit.
The minaret was.
Oh, the minaret.
That, yes.
Oh, no, no, the minaret. Yes, of course, that is been controversial in Switzerland and various other countries. We weren't asked to design a minaret. You know, our client, as I said, our client was a very interesting client, and he didn't ask for one. Basically, he took the view that minarets were created for a reason, so that people could be called to prayer. And in the age of, you know, virtual, you know, the technology that we have today, that they're surplus to requirements is the view that he took. So I mean, we didn't even have to consider that. And actually, I would agree with him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it's that they're not really necessary. I think we've managed to create a building that has combines. You know, sacred traditions of the UK and Islam without creating one. I hope.
Well, certainly traditions are not static.
No, exactly.
Another question on the recognition and acknowledgement of going beyond the standard image of a mosque, but why the Golden Dome? Professor Ali Al-Aroof asked that one. Why the Golden Dome, and how is the reaction? Any reaction to the lack of the minaret?
Well, we haven't had a reaction to the lack of a minaret. I'm not quite sure that hasn't really been a subject that's been discussed widely. But the dome actually came slightly later in the process. Originally, we didn't have a dome. That was something that was requested at a later stage by some of the funders, yeah, but we were quite happy to accommodate it. I think the design was flexible enough to be able to accommodate it, and the way the dome sits in the prayer hall, it's not centrally placed. It's placed to one side, to the side of the Qibla wall, and in the center, and that, in quite a kind of subtle way, indicates the Qibla wall, which is, and yet accommodates the idea of the dome, of being close to the heavenly geometry of the dome.
From Noah Hussein, regarding the mosque project and all of your projects, so your team must be very diverse and include offices from around the area. How do you manage to coordinate work with such a team? That might get to the virtual aspects of how you work.
Well, our team is actually quite small. So we just have 15 people. We don't have very many international projects at the moment. So that's actually not difficult. We managed to you know, have design review sessions every Monday afternoon, where we bring together all the people in the office, and we managed to invite ideas from all members, and the best ideas rise to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think, aren't you with Gamal? Are you at NTU today? Is that where you're speaking from?
Yes,
or?
yes. No, I am actually in Nottingham, so it's
Great.
not virtual. I'm actually here
See,
in
had
this
we been
beautiful
there?
building.
So it's partly a hybrid keynote here.
Yeah.
Debbie Whalen says some wonderful and elegant inclusions of sustainable principles in contemporary design. And I'm really glad you mentioned social sustainability, very important for the users of the mosque. The question is, how do you consider the contribution of many parts of the global South, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, in the process, given the strong ambition to move towards modernity, but also a hand-to-mouth economy in many instances? As she goes on, cement, for example, is prestige. Demolition and rebuild obliterates vestiges of colonialism, which is important, and the need to drive gas guzzlers is also a marker of prestige and power. Promoting principles in the global North will get more traction, but I'm concerned that the South is generally forgotten. Any bright ideas?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree entirely with those sentiments. I mean, you know, the climate emergency is actually created by a very small percentage of the population, that, and it's certainly not created by the global South, and they tend to be the ones that are suffering most from it. It's very, you know, I think climate justice is a very, very key issue, and how we actually make sure in moving towards a low carbon economies and a low carbon design, that we make sure that the global South does not suffer any more than it needs to. It's a huge issue, and we need to kind of be thinking about it all the time to make sure that there is, as I say, climate justice.
Professor Hownice asks, you rightfully emphasize how to develop a new vernacular architecture within the serious conditions of climate change. If we ask you, what is your positive picture of the world, your dream, so to speak, what would it be, perhaps? Beauty, other things?
Well, I tend to think that beauty comes from the kind of a design process that actually takes into account quite practical things. I think it was Buckminster Fuller that says, you know, first of all, you start by solving a problem, a design problem, and then if at the end it's not beautiful, you know, you've done something wrong. I think that we just need to change the way we do everything. We need to see the world through the lens of the climate emergency, and it needs to affect all of our choices that we make. As I say, even whether we build or not, you know, and the economy that we have, because, you know, time is short. I mean, that, you know, the fact that the IPCC report came out in August saying that, you know, if we carry on using carbon in the way that we are, we're going to tip beyond the 1.5 degrees in terms of the carbon use in 5.5 years. I mean, you know, it's absolutely critical that we take this very seriously right now.
From Amir Gohar, the high rises, this is back to the high rises. The high rises that are built ignoring the local context are highly influencing architecture education and inspiring the young generations of architects. How would you respond to students who see this, you know, these types of designs as really an inspiration? I'm adding on here because I see this in my studios as well. How do you respond to students who strive to become designers of such buildings without paying any attention to the local culture? You know, some students look, for example, at Corbusiers' Vauçois plan and don't see problems with that, which is a complete obliteration of the historic core. So how do you see a response to the next generation of architects?
Well, I think that architectural education needs to change and respond to the climate emergency just as everybody else does. And, you know, it's part of the education to show that, you know, that these considerations need to be made. And I think the kind of the modern movement, you know, global architecture, where a building in, you know, Dubai could be built in China, could be built in London, could be built in Johannesburg. Personally, I think that those days are numbered, and that we need to take into consideration local conditions, local materials. We can't be transporting, huge amounts of granite from China to our buildings in London anymore. We just have to stop. We have to stop emitting so much carbon. I mean, this is the main thing. We have to listen to the scientists, and we have to say, well, hang on a minute, if we're not going to build them out of steel and concrete, maybe we should build them out of timber, and maybe the timber should come from, come locally. I mean, there are timber towers that have been built in Norway and in Canada, I think, that are making these innovations, and that's, I think, the way we need to look.
Right. Yeah, my studio this fall at the University of Oregon, we have a grant to study cross-laminated timber projects on federal lands, so we're going to be looking.
Great. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that needs to happen. Yeah.
Well, we have a couple more minutes before we need to break. The Vice President of IASTE is Montira Hoyangura. Montira, you have a question? Can you come off mute and ask your question?
Hi, yes, Julia, thanks very much for your talk, and that was very inspiring to see all the examples from your practice. I have a question related to the theme of the conference, which, as you know, is on the topic of virtual traditions. We've heard a variety of papers that show how virtual traditions encompasses different concepts of virtuality, not just through technology, but also through the means of other simulacra that transcend space and time. And so can you remark on the process of placemaking through the displacement of tradition, for instance, through borrowing or through inspiration from other traditions in your practice, for instance, in the Cambridge Mosque project?
I'm not sure that we have actually done a lot of work on that. I mean, obviously the mosque has created a huge kind of social media interest. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that you mean, because that's actually, virtual impact of it has been considerable throughout the UK, and the number of visitors that have come to visit it has been huge. From the virtual to the real. I think that's been an unexpected result of what we've done there. But I don't know if that partially answers your question.
I think in the interest of time, we're come to an end.
We are coming to an end. Julia, so you've set a new tradition. You were a speaker at our first virtual workshop last year, so thank you so much for that. And now you've been a keynote speaker at our first virtual conference. I'm hoping that it's one of our last virtual conferences, though. But thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to share with us your thoughts on this topic. We certainly appreciate it. Gamal, thank you as well for the introduction and for hosting Julia and connecting Julia to IASTE. It is break time, everybody. So please enjoy the next break. Sessions will start at the top of the hour. Take care. Thanks, Julia.